Okay, section 3. Let's talk about financial repression in China, right? I think I mentioned earlier here in our lecture that the Chinese system is one of financial repression, that the government plays a very important role in managing every little aspect of the economy and the financial system, in large part because they have these goals of control. They have this goal of export promotion, and they also have this goal of using the Chinese banking and financial system as a way of paying the bills, right? So let's talk about this here a little bit. If I can find my PowerPoint. So Chinese banks are not inefficient because of decision making alone, right? These financial repressions, such as the undervalued exchange rate, right, help to keep exports high. But this also, represses the financial system, meaning it makes it not as efficient as it should be. Here's the amount of foreign reserve holdings by country. You can see the vast amount of dollar assets. This is actually dated. Sorry, I should have updated this information. Still today, you would see that China is the largest. This number is up above 4. And I may have all sorts of mistakes here. This should be trillions. Sorry, not billions, trillions. But China has today upwards more than $4 trillion in foreign reserves. Why do they do this? Well, they try to keep their exports promoted, right? They try to keep the exchange rate undervalued that keeps exports cheap so they can sell them. So you saw me flash up this little picture. Here's a factory I went to in China where they were making, if you can see that, it's a little squirrel from those Ice Age movies, right? And just mountains and mountains of these little squirrels were being developed. And you see this all over the place in China, just the vast amount of exports, particularly in manufacturing, that China is able to produce. Here's a place in China, I'm forgetting the name of it. I want to say Yiwu. Yiwu is kind of the consumer products center of China. So basically all of these little consumer goods that are produced in China get brought to this huge, massive mall where retailers in the United States can kind of come and look at the wares and buy things. So you don't just like buy a pair of earrings, you buy 10,000 earrings, right? I mean, these are massive quantities sold. I've never seen a mall like this before. I mean, I wandered around it for like 2 hours. It was like hell on earth for me because I hate malls. But in the interest of science and academics, I wandered around. But I mean, it was just endless, right? And here you see in this picture, here's just the hair ornaments wing, right? I mean, they had wings for all sorts of ridiculous stuff. Here's another wing where they had like little electronic goods, and it just went on and on. It was really interesting just to get a scope for just the massive amount of manufacturing and consumer products that are made in China nowadays. And a lot of this has been propped up by the undervalued exchange rate. Of course, the good thing about undervalued exchange rate is that it keeps exports cheap. But as we talked about yesterday, there's some real cost to undervalued exports. It keeps standards of living very low by making consumption expensive. Imports into China are quite expensive. And so that keeps standards of living low, right? It's hard to get things from abroad. It also tends to create inflation, right? And so inflation also tends to eat away at people's real income and eat away at their savings, right? Now, the government tries to put a lid on inflation a couple of ways. One way is they really keep required reserves high on banks. Why? Because that reduces the money multiplier and keeps money growth low. So the People's Bank of China can increase the monetary base without getting a very big increase in the money supply. The People's Bank of China also increases the required reserve ratio, which keeps, did I say that? Maybe I confused. They keep the required reserve ratio high, and they also require banks to hold a lot of government bonds. Both of these reduce the money multiplier. That's what I'm trying to say. Both of these reduce the money multiplier, reduce money growth and keep inflation lower than it should be, given all of the amount of the monetary base that they produce, to try to keep the exchange rate undervalued. And then, as I mentioned before, to keep banks profitable, given they have to hold all these required reserves that don't make any money, and they have to hold all these government bonds that don't really make much money, the government imposes interest rate ceilings. However, these interest rate ceilings are less than inflation, so real interest rates there are really negative. This helps banks. It's one of the things that makes Chinese banks profitable, but it provides very little returns to households. And so for most households, saving your money in the bank is really not a very attractive way to save. But the flip side is, where are you going to save, right? Where else are you going to save? You're just going to put money in your mattress? Most Chinese citizens have all the savings, but they don't know where to save and they don't know where to diversify it. So this leads to the next aspect of the Chinese financial system. Where do people save? And people tend to save in two kind of outside of banks. People do not see stock markets as a good bet because nobody trusts the stock market. So what do you trust? They tend to trust other people, and they tend to trust real estate. And so let's talk about these in order. Where does some of this savings go that doesn't go to the banks? It goes into asset bubbles in China, all right? So because there's all this savings, sloshing around, and because there's a lot of speculation in housing, particularly and a lot of transparency, this can lead to asset bubbles, right? And this is what history has told us. When there's a lot of liquidity and a lack of transparency and too much speculation, you get asset bubbles. And that's definitely what we see in China. You see this investment bubble, right? Where Chinese government and Chinese firms build these massive factories. This is the second largest train station in Shanghai. Look at the size of this thing. The second largest train station in Shanghai, right? I mean, it's just amazing, the massive amounts of investment. And you have to ask yourself, is this really productive? I mean, does the second largest train station in Shanghai need to be this big? I'm not sure it does, right? I'm not sure it does. When we were in China in December, we visited the new airport in Beijing, which I believe now is going to be the world's largest airport to Beijing, with 8-lane highways into and out of it. And it was almost empty. Now, of course, China's kind of building this forward, thinking about future growth and that, it'll get more popular over time, blah, blah, blah. But you also just have to wonder, like, does China really need something this big and expensive, right? I mean, you just wonder, what are the incentives? Was this driven by profit and efficiency, or was this driven by the ability for somebody to get a bribe or a kickback off of? I mean, you just never know in China. You just never know. So at the same time, you have, huge investment that looks like this. You have a lot of Chinese citizens that are living like this, right? That really looks like third world, right? That is very, very basic, only above extreme poverty, but not greatly above extreme poverty. And, oftentimes when you're going back around in China, you kind of get whiplash between parts of China that make you think you're in the middle of New York City and parts of China that make you think you're in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Because you can definitely get whiplash. A lot of the money that people save that doesn't go in the banks goes into the housing market, right? Housing is probably the one thing that people put their money in, right? And in part, I think it's seen as a safe bet, safe as houses. And then in part, because Chinese families are a very important part of life, this is how you invest for your children. This is how you invest for your son or daughter, particularly your daughter who's going to get married, right? You need to get her an apartment to make her a more attractive match. And so people just pour their savings into these housing markets, which leads to a lot of housing price appreciation. In the top 4 cities in China, prices have been rising about 20 to 30% a year. In the next 31 cities, almost 10% a year. The rest of China, about zero, right? So the housing bubble is not all over China. It's mainly in these major cities. Nowadays, real estate alone accounts for more than 25% of GDP in China, which is, once again, kind of an amazing number. And so one of the things you see in China is you'll see these vast neighborhoods in which people have built houses or housing developments or apartment complex, but they sit empty. They're built as an investment, but yet there's nobody yet that can buy them, that can afford to buy them. And so you build them and they still see their prices appreciate at 20% a year, and yet nobody's living in them. Right? They're simply based on the expectation that sometime, somewhere, someone out there is going to be stupid enough to overpay for this, right? That is the greater fool theory of investing. And I think that drives a lot of housing prices in Beijing, right? So in Beijing, in particular, the price to income ratio is more than 40. To give you some idea, in the US, most US banks will only lend you about 2 or 2.5 times your annual income. So put that in perspective. In Beijing, 40 times your annual income is how much a house is worth, right? When we were in China, we for a long time worked with a woman by the name of Yan, who has lived in Shanghai most of her life. I would consider her to be middle class. Maybe upper middle class, because I think her husband has a very good job. But she just rented a new apartment in Shanghai because of some complicated living arrangements. And the apartment, I didn't get to see the apartment, but it's a very modest apartment by her descriptions. And the apartment cost about $20,000 a month, right? That's not to buy, that's the rent. If you bought, she said the mortgage payment would be about $35,000 a month. So right off the bat, you know something's wrong, right? when renting prices are that much different from mortgage prices, it tells you that there's some sort of bias in the system towards buying a house, right? Or not buying a house, right? Depending upon which side of the transaction you're on. But just those prices, it's hard to imagine how China, where per capita income is about $24,000 a year, how that many people are affording $20,000 a month for an apartment, right? It's just crazy. And a lot of these apartments are not really great places, right? It's widely recognized that the average quality of a Chinese house is pretty low and only has about 20 years. So, I mean, it looks so much like a bubble. It looks so much like a bubble. And you don't just get bubbles in housing, you get them in all these other weird things too, like pigeons, right? People collect pigeons, or tiger penis because of its medicinal purposes, right? Where people are paying these astronomical amounts for these things. You even see this in housing prices in Iowa City, right? Where I am right now, where I live. Iowa City has a really big contingent of Chinese students. And so a lot of these students come to University of Iowa to study, and their parents use that as an opportunity to buy them a house here and get money out of China, right? And their thinking is, oh, houses are great, and look how cheap houses are, right? Of course, everyone in Iowa thinks every house in Iowa City is ridiculously expensive, but relative to Chinese prices, they look cheap. And so you see Chinese students coming here and buying up all of the good real estate in Iowa City, right? It goes to show you the pressure that many of these Chinese families have to find someplace reasonable to save, even if it's all the way in some place where probably many of them have never heard of. So yeah, there's a real estate bubble in China. And it just keeps on going up and up and up year after year. The other way that people save their money is that they basically serve as banks themselves. They do a lot of underground lending. And so let's take a break here and we'll come back and talk about that part of the story.